A knife made of obsidian, black as wet stone, catches the firelight. Somewhere in a village whose name did not survive into any language we speak, a woman is dying, and a man kneels beside her holding that blade like it might be the only thing standing between one heartbeat and none. He is not a surgeon. There is no such word yet. He is simply the one who did not run. That single image, a blade, a body, a decision made in seconds, is the whole story of this video. Compressed into one frame, we will return to twice more before the end. The surface question is simple enough to fit on a search bar. Did ancient people perform cesarean sections? The deeper question is the one that actually keeps historians up at night, not whether the cut was made, but whether anyone walked away from it. Because cutting a body open is easy. Ancient humans did that constantly. On animals, on enemies, on each other. The real mystery is survival. And for most of human history, survival was not part of the equation at all. Here is the partial answer. So you're not left waiting. Yes, the cut existed in antiquity, but for most of that history. It was not a delivery method. It was a last rite. The full unpacking of what that means is still ahead. Start with the anatomy, because everything else depends on it. A cesarean section requires cutting through skin, fat, muscle, and the wall of the uterus itself, a structure engineered by evolution to be extraordinarily hard to breach, without catastrophic bleeding. Modern surgery controls that bleeding with clamps, sutures that dissolve on a schedule, and drugs that make the uterus contract on command. Ancient surgeons had none of that. They had blades of flint, bronze, or obsidian. They had plant-based dressings. They had, at best, an intuitive sense that infection followed dirty wounds, though not the faintest idea why. That should stop you cold, because it means the procedure was survivable for the infant almost from the beginning, but almost never survivable for the mother. That asymmetry is the hinge the entire history swings on. So why do it at all? Here's where the story stops being simple. The earliest recorded justification for the procedure wasn't medical rescue, it was something closer to religious law. In several ancient legal traditions, a pregnant woman who died before giving birth could not be buried with the child still inside her. The fetus had to be removed, sometimes for ritual purity, sometimes on the belief the child might still be saved, sometimes simply because burial customs demanded it. That means for centuries. The operation we now associate with saving a mother's life was almost exclusively performed after her life was already over. That reframes everything. This wasn't a surgery in the way we understand surgery, a controlled intervention with the patient's survival as the goal. It was closer to an emergency exception carved into the boundary between life, death, and law. Picture ancient Rome, centuries before the empire's peak. Roman legal tradition later systematized under what history calls the Lex Regia, and its imperial successor, the Lex Caesarea, held that no pregnant woman could be buried until the child was removed from her body. This wasn't framed as an act of medicine. It was framed as an act of law and piety, carried out by whoever was present, often with none of what we'd recognize today as clinical skill. Here's the detail that surprises most people. This is very likely where the word Cesarean comes from, not, as popular legend insists, from Julius Caesar's own birth. The evidence against that legend is strong. Caesar's mother, by multiple ancient accounts, lived for decades after his birth, at a time when maternal survival of this procedure was close to unheard of. The myth is memorable. The etymology it claims is almost certainly wrong. That should make you pause. One of history's most repeated facts may itself be a kind of ancient misdirection proof that even stories about origins need to be excavated as carefully as bones. Layer 1. Textual evidence. Legal and religious texts from multiple ancient civilizations, Roman, and separately, threads within early Jewish legal writing describe the post-mortem procedure explicitly enough that historians treat it as well-documented practice, not speculation. This is evidence, not inference. The words exist. The intent behind them is stated plainly. Layer 2. Mythological evidence. Move to a different register, entirely myth. Multiple ancient cultures, independently of one another, told stories of extraordinary births involving a cut rather than the ordinary passage of birth. In Greek myth, the god Dionysus is said to have been sewn into Zeus's thigh after being removed early. In some traditions from ancient India, epic literature describes births achieved through means other than natural labor. This is not evidence that surgery happened, it's evidence of something almost as interesting, that ancient people were already imagining the possibility of a body being opened to deliver life, long before it was medically real for the mother. The myth ran ahead of the medicine. Layer 3. Archaeological ambiguity. This is where honesty matters most. Direct physical evidence of ancient Cesarean surgery, a skeleton, an instrument, a wound pattern that unmistakably proves the procedure, is exceptionally rare and, in most cases, effectively non-existent from deep prehistory. What survives is textual and circumstantial, not skeletal. Historians infer the practice existed largely from law and literature, not from the bodies themselves. That gap is not a failure of the historical record. It's a clue about how invisible surviving mothers were to the record keepers of the ancient world because there were almost none to record. Layer 4. Instrument evidence. Surgical tools recovered from ancient sites, bronze and iron blades, some specifically cataloged by archaeologists as consistent with abdominal cutting, tell us the technical capability existed early. A sharp enough edge to open a body was never the limiting factor. The limiting factor was everything that had to happen after the cut. Each layer, stacked, tells a consistent story. Ancient civilizations had the concept, the legal framework, the mythic imagination, and the tools. What they did not have was the missing piece that turns a wound into a survivable event. Now for the piece historians genuinely argue about. Some traditional and folkloric accounts passed down orally in various cultures long before written medical record, keeping describe maternal survival of the procedure in antiquity, not just fetal removal after death. One version of this, often repeated, involves a 16th century Swiss farmer said to have performed the operation on his own wife, who reportedly survived. Here's the fair-minded version of the debate. Some historians treat this account as a genuine, if extraordinary, early case of maternal survival, made possible by luck, an unusually shallow or precise incision, and a body that resisted infection against every odd. Other historians are openly skeptical, noting the story was recorded decades after it supposedly happened, filtered through retelling, and fits suspiciously well into the folklore pattern of the miracle healer narrative common across early modern Europe. The honest answer sits in between. It is plausible, poorly documented, and impossible to verify with the certainty the story is usually given. Genuine uncertainty. Not proof either way. For most of this video, we've been standing in the fog of oral tradition, legal text, and myth indirect evidence, filtered through centuries of retelling. Now the ground shifts. As written medical record-keeping matures, particularly from the early modern period onward, something changes. We move from inferring the procedure existed to reading direct accounts of it being attempted on living women, described by observers who were actually present. That transition is itself the reveal. It's not that Cesarean surgery suddenly appears in history, it's that history finally develops the tools to witness it properly. Before this point, we are archaeologists piecing together shadows. After it, we are reading eyewitness testimony. The story doesn't begin here. Our ability to actually see it does. Here's where it gets tangible. In the late 19th century, a European medical missionary documented, in detailed written and illustrated form, a cesarean section performed by traditional healers in what is now Uganda on a living woman, who survived. The account describes something remarkable. Practitioners using banana wine as an antiseptic wash, cauterizing blood vessels with a heated iron to control bleeding, and applying a root paste dressing to the wound, all techniques developed independently, without any contact with European surgical science. That detail should stop you. A community, working entirely outside the medical tradition most history books credit with inventing safe surgery, had already solved several of the exact problems: infection control, bleeding control, that had made the operation lethal for thousands of years elsewhere. The missing piece wasn't cleverness. It was never cleverness. Ancient and traditional peoples were plenty clever. It was infrastructure, antiseptic method, bleeding control, and the accumulated, transmissible knowledge to make survival repeatable rather than miraculous. It's tempting, at this point, to picture ancient people as one uniform group who simply didn't know how to keep a mother alive. Resist that. The variation between cultures, regions, and even individual practitioners was enormous. Some communities, like the one just described, developed sophisticated antiseptic adjacent techniques centuries before germ theory existed anywhere. Others had no comparable practice at all. Think of it the way you'd think about modern global health today. Outcomes for the same medical event vary wildly depending on where in the world you happen to be born, and who happens to be in the room with you. Ancient obstetric survival wasn't a single global average, it was a patchwork, shaped by local knowledge, local plants, local trial and error, passed down and refined generation by generation in some places, and lost or never developed in others. Two things rarely make it into the popular version of this story. First, the psychological weight carried by whoever held the blade. In most documented traditional accounts, the person performing the procedure wasn't a specialist in the modern sense, often a midwife, an elder, or a family member, making an irreversible decision under unbearable pressure, usually already knowing the mother's odds were poor. That is not a footnote. That is the emotional center of gravity for this entire history, an act performed not from confidence, but from refusal to do nothing. Second, the underappreciated role of maternal anatomy variation itself. Historical and traditional accounts occasionally describe cases where a mother's pelvis was unusually narrow, or labor had stalled for reasons no one present could diagnose, meaning the alternative to surgery wasn't a normal birth at all, but a slower, equally fatal outcome. In many of these cases, cutting wasn't chosen over a safe delivery. It was chosen over a birth that was already going to end badly, regardless. Now layer in the reality of ancient daily life. There was no sterile room, no electric light, no guarantee of a second attendant, of clean water on demand, of any pain relief beyond, at best, fermented drink or certain plant preparations. Whoever operated did so by firelight or daylight, on a dirt floor or a woven mat, with whatever blade was sharpest that week. That changes the calculus entirely. Survival in these conditions wasn't primarily a question of surgical skill. It was a question of controlling two invisible enemies, bleeding and infection, with almost none of the tools required to fight either one. Skill mattered. But biology, more often than not, made the final decision. And here's the continuity, not just the comparison. Cesarean sections are, today, one of the most common surgical procedures on the planet, performed on a significant share of all births worldwide, in clean rooms, with anesthesia, antibiotics, and monitoring equipment that would have looked like sorcery to anyone standing in that ancient room. We still do this. The procedure never went away. What changed wasn't the idea. It was everything surrounding it, the infrastructure of survival that ancient practitioners were reaching toward blindly, with banana wine and heated iron and desperate hope, long before science could hand them the rest of the toolkit. There's something worth sitting with here. Humans have apparently never stopped trying to answer this exact question: how do we save both lives when birth itself turns dangerous? Every era answers it with the tools it has: bronze blades and burial law, traditional antiseptics and heated iron, sterile theaters and monitors that beep in rhythm with a heartbeat. The tools change. The impulse behind them, the refusal to accept an ending, does not. So, were cesarean sections performed in ancient times? Yes, but almost always on women who had already died, as an act of law and ritual rather than rescue. And it wasn't until traditional and, later, formal medical practice developed real methods for controlling bleeding and infection that the procedure quietly transformed from a rite for the dead into a rescue for the living. Return to that room. The blade, the firelight, the man who did not run. We don't know his name. We never will. But somewhere in the space between that obsidian edge and the first breath it may have helped deliver, the entire future of surgical medicine was already waiting, unrecognized, for someone to give it time. That's the larger truth underneath all of this. Progress rarely arrives as a single, brilliant idea. It arrives as generations of people, in rooms with no name and no record, refusing to let go of someone they loved until, one day, refusing was finally enough. The blade didn't save her. Not yet. But it was never really about the blade. It was about the hand that held it, and the person it was not yet willing to lose.